Homeland Security and Investigations will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recesses of the subcommittee at any time. We welcome everyone to today's hearing. Ms. Jackson Lee is on her way. Mr. Conyers is with us. We have a nice group on our side, and I know Chairman Goodlatte, this means a lot to him as well. So we'll work the openings in as people come, and I will recognize myself for my opening. I want to thank you again for being here today. This is our second hearing in a series to examine the Justice Department and its component agencies to identify areas where we can make our justice system both fully respected and fully worthy of respect. So I want to thank both of you, not just for being here today, but also for your long, distinguished careers in public service, which we will go into in more detail when you're introduced. As we all know, the Drug Enforcement Administration and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives plays a critical role in protecting the safety and security of our communities. If you'll allow me just a brief moment of personal indulgence, as former prosecutors like to do from time to time, we like to reminisce on the last good job we had, which was being a prosecutor. And I can tell you too that what you remember are the victims and their courage and heroism. And you remember the men and women of law enforcement and their integrity. You forget about the bad rulings, you forget about the jury verdicts that didn't go your way, you even after time forget about the defense attorneys. But you don't ever forget the women and men that you work with in law enforcement and especially the victims. So, Mr. Rosenberg, when I see DEA, of course I think of the nation's premier narcotics investigation entity, but I really think about the DEA agents whose name may never be known and never be called in a public hearing, but do the work. I won't call the names of the folks in South Carolina because I'm going to leave one of them out, but I would be very grateful if you could let the women and men who are still in DEA from yesterday and those that are there now know how grateful each of us across both sides of the aisle are for their work. And Mr. Brandon, the same to you. You and I know some ATF agents. We both know some of the same ones, and they remain some of the fondest memories that I have from that time period of my life. If you would let the folks in South Carolina know how grateful we are for their continued service, and those who once served in South Carolina but have spread out across the country, I'd be grateful to you for that. We have a lot of challenges. In my home state of South Carolina, at least 95 people died from heroin in 2015, which is almost twice as many as the previous year, and more than 500 died from abuse of prescription opioids over that same time period. Roughly half of these deaths attributed to drug overdose in South Carolina involved a synthetic opioid, which is almost 100 times more potent than morphine. And not only are we seeing an increase in deaths due to drug abuse, but we've also seen a recent spike in violent crime nationwide. To be fair, violent crime has been going down for a long time. And once it goes down so low, it only has one place to go. But I do think that we ought to be mindful of the fact that there has been, at least in certain categories as they keep statistics, something of a spike. In 2016, violent crime increased in many of our nation's largest cities, which is the second year that metro areas saw an increase in homicide, robbery, and aggravated assault. No agency is perfect. Congress certainly is not perfect, which may represent an understatement of biblical proportions, but it is our duty as an oversight body, as flawed as we are, to ensure that law enforcement agencies learn from mistakes, use taxpayer dollars responsibly and efficiently, to remain committed to their core missions of protecting the American people. We have a justice system that is looked to by everyone for fairness, efficiency, thoroughness, professionalism. Public safety is, at least in my judgment, the preeminent function of government, inasmuch as it is a subset of national security, and at the state and local level, public safety may be tied with education as the preeminent function of government. So it's not only incredibly important, it's incredibly important how people perceive the system. It can be fair but not perceived that way, and we still have a problem. So I know that both of you feel that way, or you would not have devoted your lives to the pursuit of justice. Over the course of the next several months, I want to work with both of you, not just in public hearings, but also privately, to make sure that Congress is doing everything it can do to enable you to fulfill your missions, and also to reflect on your missions, to make sure that we are pursuing the toughest where necessary and the smartest at all times policies we can, whether it is drug overdoses, narcotics trafficking, violent crimes, firearms trafficking, any other issue that impacts public safety and the well-being of our fellow citizens. I know that both of you, each of you, and each member of this committee wants not just the best, but the most respected justice system we can possibly have. And part of that is having frank conversations about sentencing laws and declination levels, 924Es, mental health, how it impacts your ability to do your job, how we as a society are treating mental health related issues. The justice system is, I was eating dinner with Tim Scott last night, who is a senator from South Carolina, and the person I respect most in politics. We have to have a justice system that people respect. And we have to be willing to ask tough questions, and we have to be willing to acknowledge that everyone doesn't perceive the justice system in precisely the same way. But it is the most unifying and equalizing force that we have in our culture. The fact that it is represented by a blindfolded woman tells us all we need to know. So you have the highest of all callings. And I'll say this in conclusion: next month, Congress recognizes National Police Week. That's in May. This is April. I'm not going to wait till May. I want to say, as a husband and a father and a citizen, how much I appreciate the line of work that y'all have chosen to go into, and make sure the women and men that work in your agencies know how grateful we are. That won't stop us from doing oversight, but it'll make us cognizant of the challenges that some people have volunteered for to keep other people safe. And with that, I would recognize the ranking member from Texas, Ms. Jackson-Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to my colleagues and members, and good morning to the witnesses. Forgive me for my slight delay. I was just in a meeting dealing with the famine in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. I think you may have heard of that disastrous occurrence, and I thank the chairman for his indulgence as we were trying to deliberate on very disastrous outcome to those individuals that are starving. But I join my chairman in acknowledging both Mr. Rosenberg and Mr. Brandon, and appreciate very much the service that the ATF and the DEA gives. One of my greatest pleasures, serving for a good number of years on the Judiciary Committee, was the many men and women in law enforcement on the federal level that I've had to encounter, sometimes in tragic circumstances. I go back on this committee, Mr. Conyers, which I cannot compete with him and his tenure, but we go back to the Waco incident. We go back to the issues with DEA, with just the enormous drug trafficking cartels when cities seemed to be collapsing. And it was the collaboration with local authorities that our federal officers provided such a great, if I might say, friendship, but also being part of solving problems. With respect to the DEA, I think our massive omnibus opioid bill hopefully will, at least on the treatment side, on the intervention side, really be a big boost to your work, because we always hear our neighbors, such as Mexico, suggesting that we are the problem. I don't yield to that, but I do know that we need to get those who are sick and addicted so that you can purge these evil people who violently will perpetrate the business of drugs on innocent communities all over the country. And your work certainly includes a large part of that. With respect to ATF, and I must take a moment to indicate that I flew up yesterday in the backdrop of the killing of Constable Chief Greenwood, and I offered my sympathy to him on the floor yesterday. And again, I offer it today, and this is a gentleman that had been a district attorney and decided that he loved the law so much that as he retired from the district attorney's office, he would go into being a constable. And I don't know if we're familiar with that in other jurisdictions, but constables are like sheriffs over certain jurisdictions, and he was in that capacity, was a chief deputy constable, and there's a long story about all of his work, and he was getting out of his car and it was execution style. So we know that it was purposeful and it was the illegal use of guns. And I hope that we will be able to discuss these issues. I am a member of the Congressional Gun Violence Prevention Task Force and Policing Strategies Working Group that my chairman and chairman of the full committee and ranking member of the full committee are also members of. And we're looking at a number of issues, but I think it is important to emphasize the crucial work of the DEA and ATF. In particular, every day in America, on average, 93 people die from gun violence, including 7 children and teens. That amounts to more than 33,000 people dying from gun violence in this country every year. And so I am interested in hearing how we are able to enforce laws and to certainly try to work collaboratively on the importance of weeding out, if you will, those who would use guns illegally, those who would traffic guns, which contribute to the dangers of drugs even more, because those who are in heavy drug trafficking, major drug trafficking, certainly are using weapons of choice, which are guns. I've introduced H.R. 62, the Gun Violence Reduction Resources Act, which authorizes the hiring of additional 200 ATF agents and investigators for enforcement of existing gun laws. I certainly don't want to see a budget that diminishes the resources, and I think all of us at this table have indicated that we believe in law enforcement that is just, and that means that we adhere to the principles of no racial profiling. We adhere to the principles of ensuring that the case that we make against individuals is a just case on the facts. And I believe that in many instances, in most instances, our federal officers abide by that. So we need them to be able to protect the people that are really the victims, either of the surge of drugs, large cartels, large shipments, as well as individuals who are taking up guns just to be violent. We passed, as many of you know, in 2010, we lowered the crack powder sentencing disparity from 101 to 18 to 1. Many local jurisdictions around the nation are assessing penalties on drug use, on individual drug use and individual possession in a way that does not incarcerate. So it's a combination of thinking that is on this committee, and we need your insight as we try to balance that individual person who's possessing versus some of the large actors and perpetrators that many of you address, whether it is in gun trafficking or whether it is, of course, in major trafficking. Let me finish my point with respect to the DEA, Mr. Chairman, just on a point to indicate that there are new drugs on the market, and I'll be interested in hearing, Mr. Rosenberg, how you're keeping up with those, and how each new nuance of drug, the artificial drugs, play into the federal enforcement and what we can be helpful in. And Mr. Brandon, be a series of questions that I'll ask as well with respect to your work and how we can be helpful in saving lives. Mr. Chairman, I thank you and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair will now recognize the chairman of the full committee, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Goodlatte.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your holding this hearing today, and I want to welcome Acting Administrator Rosenberg and Acting Director Brandon, and I want to thank both of you for your service, and I'm happy that you're here with us today. In April of 2015, during the tenure of DEA's former administrator, I was very concerned about systemic problems in the DEA disciplinary process, which had permeated several levels of management. At that time, the Inspector General testified about serious misconduct by DEA agents as well as their supervisors. In addition, over the past 2 years, the Inspector General has conducted audits and examinations of DEA's confidential source program, the El Paso Intelligence Center, and DEA's aviation operations in Afghanistan. There were numerous findings of mismanagement of resources and significant lapses in oversight. I am eager to hear what changes you've made, Mr. Rosenberg, to rebuild the American public's trust in the DEA. It is vital that the people have trust in federal law enforcement because America's prescription drug and heroin epidemic is severe and growing. It affects Americans throughout the country and does not discriminate on the basis of socioeconomic status. In 2015, there were over 52,000 drug overdose deaths in the United States. More than 60% of those deaths were attributable to prescription opioids or heroin. Compounding this epidemic are the importation and distribution of synthetic drugs, including several variations of the drug fentanyl. Although fentanyl has a medical use in certain situations, greedy drug traffickers and their industrial chemists are flooding our country with synthetic versions of fentanyl and other drugs, sending Americans to emergency rooms and, unfortunately, often to their deaths. These issues have rightfully gained Congress's attention. While Congress has and is taking action to combat opioid abuse and treat addiction, I would like to hear what tools DEA needs in this fight and what DEA is doing to stop the flow of illegal drugs and to prevent the diversion of prescription drugs into the illicit market. In that same vein, I would like to hear what tools ATF needs to curb the surge in gun violence that has plagued our urban communities in recent years. We have numerous laws on the books that are there to prevent gun violence and punish those who would use a firearm illegally. However, it is disheartening that the previous administration chose not to enforce those laws. In fact, the data show that prosecutions for firearms violations in fiscal year 2016 were down 34% from fiscal year 2006. This trend is simply unacceptable and must be reversed. I'm a strong believer in the rights guaranteed by the Second Amendment. At the same time, I want to ensure that law enforcement is pursuing and prosecuting those who illegally obtain and use firearms. At a recent meeting with the Attorney General, I brought this issue to his attention, and I look forward to working with him on it. While we know that no agency is without flaws, we cannot ignore those flaws and must work with those agencies to improve their performance and productivity. That's why I look forward to discussing the recent OIG reports concerning ATF's use and management of confidential informants and ATF's handling of information concerning the traffickers of 2 firearms that were used in the attack in Mexico by members of Los Zetas, drug trafficking organization, on immigration and customs enforcement agents Victor Avila and Jaime Zapata. We look forward to hearing what steps ATF is taking to address the issues raised in those reports. Acting Administrator Rosenberg and Acting Director Brandon, I thank you again for being here and for your continued service. I look forward to your testimony, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Chairman yields back. The chair will now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Conyers.
Thank you, Chairman Gowdy. I join in welcoming our acting administrator for DEA and our acting director for ATF. Welcome, gentlemen. This is a complicated activity that we're in this morning. Both agencies have difficult missions, at least in part because our nation has differing attitudes about what their respective missions should be. It was President Nixon, as part of his war on drugs, that established the Drug in 1973, and decades later, after billions of dollars were spent and policies that led to mass incarceration, which I criticize even today, many of our citizens question whether we have pursued the right approach. As for alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, although the history of this agency has led its accumulating responsibility for a variety of issues, its role in protecting us from firearms violence has been the focus of scrutiny and concern. I have no doubt that the questions raised about the missions of these agencies have made it difficult for their dedicated agents and employees, particularly given the risk many of them undergo on a daily basis. We must take action to strengthen our firearm laws by expanding background checks, by banning assault weapons and high-capacity ammunition magazines, and strengthening prohibitions against straw purchases. We must look at several criticisms that have been made on both agencies in recent years. We must have stability in management, and I think that's a huge problem. We must have clear policies regarding employee misconduct and improve trust between these agencies and the public. In raising these issues, we do so because we have to improve two very vital Department of Justice agencies. We must go after, in the Drug Enforcement Agency, the major traffickers and move away from punishing the low-level street dealers and addicts with unnecessarily severe mandatory minimum sentences. The Office of the Inspector General has issued a report on the use of confidential informants that's fairly critical. And their report on the review of investigations of Osorio and Barbara firearms trafficking rings, as had been mentioned, is critical. The New York Times article regarding secret bank account of ATF needs to be discussed today. The Inspector General's report on undercover storefront operatives and the Turk white paper are all critical. And we need to do as much as we can to get behind the attempt to not deal with appropriation riders that cater to the gun lobby. And so this is a hugely important responsibility. Funding through appropriations to hire personnel and funds for accomplishing the mission, and as a strong supporter of gun safety and protection and the Second Amendment, I take pleasure in welcoming you here and looking forward to our discussion. And I thank the chairman.
Gentlemen, yields back. We have a very distinguished panel today. I'm going to begin by swearing in our witnesses. If you would please rise and lift your right hand. You swear the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God. May the record reflect the witnesses answered in the affirmative. You may take your seat. I am going to ask the gentleman from Texas, the former United States Attorney, Mr. Johnny Ratcliffe, to introduce our first witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to welcome my friend and former colleague to our committee, Chuck Rosenberg, currently the acting administrator of the Drug Enforcement Administration, has an incredibly distinguished record in federal law enforcement, including service as counsel to former Attorney General of the United States, John Ashcroft, Chief of Staff to the FBI Director, and in a very rare double, was United States Attorney not once but twice in both the Southern District of Texas and the Eastern District of Virginia. In dedicating the better part of 25 years to the Department of Justice and its component agencies, Administrator Rosenberg has served some of the most important law enforcement positions and handled some of the most sensitive matters of national security in both Republican and Democrat administrations. He is respected by both parties on both sides of the aisle for the very simple reason that he's known by his actions and by his reputation to be blind to the color of the jersey that you're wearing and instead always faithful to the blindfolded lady holding a set of scales. Administrator Rosenberg, it is great to see you, and thanks for being here with us today.
Thank you, sir.
Gentlemen, Texas yields back. We are equally happy to have our second witness as the Acting Director of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, Mr. Thomas Brandon. After holding leadership roles in law enforcement divisions across the country, Mr. Brandon was appointed to lead the ATF in April of 2015. Prior to his service in the ATF, Mr. Brandon served in the United States Marine Corps. We thank you both for being here and for your service to our country. Your full opening statements are part of the record, and I know the members have read them. So I would ask you to summarize your openings in 5 minutes, and there are lights that will guide you in that direction. And with that, Mr. Rosenberg, we will recognize you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, and Congressman Ratcliffe for the kind introduction. I appreciate it. It's a pleasure to be here on behalf of the men and women of the DEA. I think you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Jackson Lee said it well. These are wonderful men and women. They have difficult jobs. They try their hardest to get it right. We're not perfect, but we always try to get better. We try to be fair. We try to be just. And when we make mistakes, we, as I ask my people to do, identify them, admit them, and fix them. That's not always an easy thing to do. It's something we need to be better at, but it's something we strive toward. Let me just say a few words about the opioid and heroin epidemic. You rightly pointed out that 52,000 people died last year. Actually, the numbers are for 2015 from a fatal drug overdose. Sometimes when we use big numbers, it's hard to picture what that really is. Let me give you another way, perhaps, of thinking about it. We all remember the tragic shooting in Orlando at the Pulse nightclub. 49 innocent people were slaughtered by a madman. Imagine that happening 3 times a day, once in the morning, once in the afternoon, and once in the evening, every single day for 365 days. You do the math on that, and I have. It's roughly the number of people who died from a fatal drug overdose in 2015. These are staggering numbers, and I'm not given to hyperbole or overstatement. I hope you understand that. But what we have is an epidemic, and I think it's unprecedented. And so we're trying to think about this as broadly as we can. I think Ms. Jackson Lee points out the importance of treatment and prevention. Addiction is a disease. We have to do our supply-side law enforcement work. I think it's absolutely critical, and that's a piece of this, but it's only a piece of it. What I've told our special agents in charge around the country that I want them to do is to identify the biggest, most dangerous, and most violent threats in their jurisdictions and mitigate them. It's that simple. Whatever the biggest, most dangerous threat is, mitigate it. From there, if we're doing that, then we're doing our supply-side law enforcement work, I believe, in the right way. But there's more. We're also a regulatory agency, and we have an important role in the diversion of pharmaceuticals and prescription pills. And I think this is critical, we also have a demand reduction role. From the very first days that I was a federal prosecutor, and I agree with Chairman Gowdy, I don't think I've ever had a better job than being a federal prosecutor. I never thought we were going to enforce or prosecute our way out of this mess. What we need to do in some ways is change the culture. We need to educate and we need to prevent. And one of the ways that we do that at the DEA is through community outreach. Our demand reduction program is not as big as I'd like it to be, but in partnership with the FBI, for instance, we've produced a video called Chasing the Dragon, which we've made available to everybody free of charge to talk about the dangers of opioid addiction. We've partnered with Discovery Education to build a STEM-based curricula for middle and high school students free of charge to teach the science of opioid addiction. And twice a year, we sponsor a National Take Back Day at which citizens can take stuff out of their medicine cabinets and return it to one of 5,000 sites around the United States anonymously, free of charge, no questions asked. And the purpose of that is to break the cycle. Believe it or not, 4 out of 5 heroin users start on prescription pills. And most of those folks get those pills from a friend or a relative or from a medicine cabinet. And we have to break that cycle. And so supply-side law enforcement is crucial. I want to be very clear that we work at the highest levels possible. We're looking for that unholy alliance between violent street gangs and the cartels that supply them. But we also have to do a good job as a regulator, and we have to change the culture of drug use and addiction through our outreach programs. As I said at the outset, Mr. Chairman, it is a great privilege to represent the men and women of the DEA. These are the folks you want living next door to you. They're passionate, they're principled, and they try really, really hard to get this stuff right in a difficult and dangerous environment. And just having the opportunity to represent them is a great honor and privilege. Thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you, Mr. Rosenberg. Mr. Brandon.
Chairman Gowdy, Ranking Member Jackson Lee, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. The mission of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives is to protect communities from violent criminals, criminal organizations, the illegal use and trafficking of firearms, the illegal use and storage of explosives, acts of arsons and bombings, acts of terrorism, and the illegal diversion of alcohol and tobacco. To deliver on such a vital and unique mission, you must have quality personnel, and ATF does. Some of our special agents are former Navy SEALs, Marine Recon, Army Ranger, and Green Beret. Other special agents are former local police officers, deputy sheriffs, state troopers, and special agents from other federal law enforcement agencies. To balance our team, we have other special agents who are former teachers, emergency room nurses, urban planners, lawyers, and psychologists. ATF special agents are a distinguished group of Americans that lay it on the line every day to protect the public and serve our nation. I could not be more proud than to serve with them as an ATF special agent. Of course, ATF has other employees that are vital to our mission. Our industry operation investigators, many of whom are retired law enforcement officers and military service members, are vital to detecting the diversion of firearms and explosives to the black market. Our special agents and industry operations investigators are supported by an outstanding staff of professionals. They include attorneys, engineers, forensic scientists, intelligence research specialists, forensic auditors, IT specialists. These professionals ensure that ATF remains at the forefront of the legal, technological, and scientific developments so necessary to be effective in the challenging environment of law enforcement focuses on today. When you focus these exceptional employees to work together as one ATF on pure ATF, I believe we bring unique and special value to the American taxpayer, namely to go after the trigger puller, the firearms trafficker, the arsonist, and the criminal bomber. To remember our mission more easily, it's all about bang, boom, and burn. One of the areas I hope to highlight today is how ATF is utilizing a unique blend of talented and dedicated public servants to tackle our top mission priority, reducing violent firearms crime. Over the last 3 years, ATF has established Crime Gun Intelligence Centers, or CGICs, in all of our 25 field divisions. CGICs synthesize the skill of our special agents, our IOIs, our intelligence research specialists, our ballistic technicians, our laboratory scientists, and support staff to collect, analyze, and develop crime gun intelligence, creating timely and actionable leads for dissemination to our field agents and our local, state, federal, and tribal partners. Beyond the talent of our people, CGICs also utilize powerful intelligence tools that are unique to ATF. The firearms tracing results from our National Tracing Center in Martinsburg, West Virginia, and data from the National Integrated Ballistic Information Network, known as NIBIN, the nation's only automated ballistic imaging network. NIBIN provides critical intelligence and investigative leads through the analysis and comparison of ballistic evidence left at crime scenes. By comparing the unique marks on the ammunition's cartridge case, NIBIN produces correlations that link shooting incidences, creating actionable leads that aid in the identification of the trigger pullers who menace our community. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, for the last 2 years, I've had the honor to lead ATF. It's been the highlight of my professional career, and I openly admit that I love America, I love the men and women of ATF, and I love our mission of public safety and the regulatory mission. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Brandon. The chair will now recognize Chairman of the full committee, Mr. Goodlatte, for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Rosenberg, let me start with you. Over the past 10 years, the DEA has seized more assets than any other law enforcement component of the Department of Justice, 80% of the total. Recently, the DOJ Office of Inspector General released an audit critical of DEA's asset seizures and forfeitures. What's the DEA doing to implement OIG's recommendations?
I'm still working my way through the report, but I have a couple of things that I've taken away from it, Mr. Goodlatte. One is, as the IG said, this program is effective and important, but I think we need to do a better job of establishing linkages between seizures that we make and criminal cases that we prosecute down the road. And sometimes we've struggled with that piece of it. I don't mean to sound overly defensive, but I wanted to point out one sort of flaw, I think, in the IG's report. A lot of cases that they selected don't result in criminal enforcement, but there are reasons for that. Sometimes we'll have intelligence or from a wiretap know that a bad guy is going to drive some cash south, having sold their drugs.
Mr. Rosenberg, let me interrupt, just say I don't disagree where you have no one claiming the property, but where you do have people claiming the property, there needs to be a much more transparent and effective and cost-effective way for them to challenge the seizure of their assets and get them back if they were improperly taken. Next, let me ask you about your recently promulgated rule regarding a drug code for marijuana derivatives such as cannabidiol, and maintaining marijuana, hemp, and other derivatives as Schedule I substances. Following that, a lawsuit was filed in the Ninth Circuit. What's the current status of hemp enforcement?
Well, hemp remains a Schedule I substance. It is derived from the marijuana plant. Sorry, do you have?
Are you looking to harass hemp farmers? And
No, as long as they abide by Section 7606 of the Farm Bill, we are not looking to harass those who abide by that statute. No, sir.
All right, well, we are working on trying to make it clear that there should be an easier path for people with a product that is commercially viable for a lot of purposes, should be able to be produced in a more convenient way and more accessible to the market.
And we've worked with your staff, sir, to try and work through some of those issues. We'll continue to do so.
Let me ask you this. I am getting reports from people that there are restrictions by the DEA on the supply of buprenorphine products like Subutex and Suboxone that they're being restricted to the same level that a pharmacy sold last year. Is that true?
I don't believe so. I'll double check, but I don't think that's right. I don't think there are shortages, and I don't think...
As you know, the Congress passed and President Obama signed into law the CARE Act that promotes medication-assisted treatment, and it sounds like the DEA may be making it more difficult for people to get it, because obviously if they're being successful in getting people on these kinds of treatments, the demand's going to go up. It shouldn't be flat with last year when there's an emphasis being made on making sure people have access to things that could help them with their addictions.
Access is crucial. I don't think there's a backlog for data wave docs, at least from our perspective.
I've heard of patients having to go from pharmacy to pharmacy, spending hours trying to find a store with enough stock to fill a legal prescription.
If that's the case, again, happy to work with your committee and your staff to address it, sir.
Thank you very much. Let me turn to Mr. Brandon. Over the past 10 years, we've witnessed a precipitous drop in firearms prosecutions. In fact, during the last administration, prosecutions went down over 30% in this area. Do you have any explanation for this drop?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the question. I know in the previous administration, the operative word was impact, and that the cases, even though they would be fewer, should all be impactful. And we complied with that to try to focus on the most violent, what we call trigger pullers, and the traffickers supplying them firearms.
Let me tell you the problem I have with that. If you look at, I think, any recent year, you're going to find that a number of people lie when they fill out the instant check form for the NICS system when they purchase a firearm. Most years it's 60, 70,000 people, and most years the number of actual prosecutions is less than 100 out of 60 or 70,000. I've seen some years where it's been 40, 60. That means that if you knowingly go into a gun store and you attempt to purchase a firearm by providing false information on the form, you know as you go in that the odds of your being prosecuted, even if you're caught, and because the instant check system by no means has all the data in it that would need to detect anybody who has a conviction that should prevent them from purchasing a firearm, that the odds are less than 1 in 1,000, even if you're caught, that you're going to be prosecuted. Have you had any communications with the others in the Justice Department, the FBI, the U.S. Attorney's offices about why this prosecution rate is so low?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the question.
You know, and I wouldn't say you talked about the most serious violations. Here's the problem: if we don't send the message that this system is meant to stop people from buying firearms who are prohibited by law from buying firearms, what's the point of the system? You got to prosecute people before they commit these acts if they are purchasing firearms that they're not supposed to be purchasing.
Yes, sir. Just so you know, when we're referred on these cases by the FBI, every one is examined, and each U.S. attorney has prosecutorial guidelines, and then we'll review it against each district to see if the case would be acceptable for prosecution. If it is, then it's forwarded to the field division that has jurisdiction over that area of responsibility, and a case will be perfected. But to answer your question, we look at all of them, and then we go against the U.S. Attorney guidelines for prosecution, and if the facts and the evidence are something that fit within the guidelines, a criminal case is perfected. If it doesn't fall within the guidelines, it's not submitted.
Only 1 in 1,000 is making that cut? That just doesn't seem like a good approach. Mr. Chairman, I know I've exceeded my time. I would like to ask Mr. Brandon about one other thing, if I may.
Of course.
In Associate Deputy Director Turk's white paper, he points out that for over 2 years, representatives within the firearms licensing community have asked for clarification and/or a decision from ATF regarding new federal firearms license applicants requesting to conduct business solely at gun shows. The ATF has delayed a decision or guidance due to several concerns, including what it means to be, quote, engaged in the business, end quote, of selling firearms and ATF's ability to have access to a dealer's records where they may not have routine business hours. The ATF has already recognized FFL activities via the internet without a classic storefront and is considering whether to include gun show only activities in a similar manner. He then correctly asserts that the marketplace has changed significantly in recent years, and ATF's guidance to FFLs on these issues has not kept pace with developments in commerce. Classic brick-and-mortar storefronts with an on-hand inventory and set front-door business hours no longer apply in many instances in today's modern marketplace. What are you doing about that?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the question. On February 17th of this year, we sent a letter out to a private request saying that if the FFL wants to deal primarily at gun shows, and as long as it's compliant with state and local law, we issue the license. And so we have showed a sensitivity to the industry. If it's solely just to operate at a gun show, that would require a statutory change by this committee, I guess. But that's what we are issuing license when they're primarily selling at gun shows and that they have a place where we can go and inspect the records.
So in the meantime, what are you doing to enforce the law with regard to entities or individuals that only sell at gun shows and are not doing the background check? Because they're obviously not in compliance with the law.
Yes, yes, sir. And I know, Mr. Chairman, that when we met privately, you expressed your concern about that. One of the plans is, or what we do, is an education component. When ATF, industry operation investigators, will be at certain gun shows, they don't walk up to people. They just have a booth, and they educate them to say that if your activity falls within this, the repetitive buying of selling of firearms, principally, for profit, that you would need a federal firearms license. And also the great men and women, the federal firearms licensing community is our front line of defense. Often they'll be frustrated because they're saying, hey, I'm playing by the rules, and this guy over here is not.
You bet they're frustrated, and so are people who are frustrated who think that this way around having to comply with the NICS system is a loophole, and it should be closed. Now, not the way some people have advocated, but in terms of enforcing the law, which is very clear that if you sell a firearm at a gun show, you're required to do a background check just like anyone else is, unless you meet the narrow exceptions of an individual transaction where you're not in the business, or you're selling a collection and not selling the collection and then replenishing it and selling it again. So what is ATF's plan to go make sure that the people selling at gun shows are getting an FFL, or if they're not getting an FFL, they're not selling at gun shows?
Mr. Chairman, again, thank you for the question. We investigate allegations like this across the country. Often they come from the FFLs that are, like I just mentioned previously, are complying with the law and doing things correctly. And we'll investigate it, and if we can perfect a criminal case, we will do that and recommend it for prosecution to the U.S. Attorney's Office.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your forbearance.
You have any other questions? I've got all the time you want. All right. The chair would now recognize the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Thank you very much. And the work you do is mounting and important, and our questions are such that we all need more time. But I am constrained by the time that I have, and so let me try to focus on questions that we can get not only answers, but to be instructed as a committee to be as helpful as possible. First, I want to be clear that I think the work that the DEA and ATF does is extremely important, and I think there should be a balance between treatment and enforcement, but I think that we would be completely naive to think that the enforcement arm is not important. It would be good to get to the point, particularly as it relates to drugs, that would be less important, that we would be diminishing, if you will, the users of the product, and the suppliers would come down automatically. That's not the case. So let me raise questions to both of you dealing with some of the issues that we're concerned about. And number of questions that I have. Ms. Rosenberg, have you looked at the disparities? Obviously, you're at the more or less the top end. You might give me when you collaborate with local law enforcement, when does DEA do that? And are you seeing disparities in the arrests of more African Americans in drug use, particularly marijuana, than others, than whites in particular? And how would the DEA, in its capacity, the level that it is at, deal with that disparity?
Yeah. At the federal level,
Yes.
we represent a very small piece of the federal, of law enforcement efforts in the United States, a tiny sliver, if you would. Our main interaction with state and local law enforcement officers is through their participation as task force officers with the DEA. We have about 4,600 DEA special agents, about 2,700 task force officers that work with us. But their work, and if we're doing this right, is not aimed at low-level dealers or users. It's aimed at what I described earlier as that unholy alliance between cartels and violent street gangs. So probably the best place to go to answer your question, which I think is an important one, would be to the state and local folks.
Do you have any discussions among your team on disparities in the individuals that are arrested for drug engagement?
By race, I don't have those numbers, and I don't ask for them, and I don't keep them.
All right. On the OIG report, one of the issues of concern was the confidential informants. Mm-hmm. I just want to get an answer from you that you view that as serious. One of the issues that came up that I would be interested in as a lawyer is limited source or limited use, mm-hmm. such as, I hate to say airline employees, professionals who may be helpful. How are you answering that question? That is of great concern. It's, you're using some agents or agencies or your different units assess that source differently. How are you addressing that question?
It was actually an illuminating report, Congresswoman. We've done a couple of things that I think are important. So confidential sources, confidential informants are very important to our work, but we have to make sure we're careful. So for instance, as the report pointed out, where we were using quasi-government employees, for instance, at places like TSA and Amtrak, we've stopped that. We don't do that anymore. We now have confidential source guidelines that are fully in compliance with AG guidelines. We're now doing 90-day reviews of every single one of our confidential sources. We've put in place an awards review board so we can make sure that confidential sources are paid and treated the same way across the country. So happy to come brief you on it.
I want you to do so. Let me quickly just indicate, I think I was in Columbia when the incidents with the DEA, bad behavior, and you are handling that with respect to the kind of protocols that need to be followed. I just need...
We've revised our standards of conduct, and in fact, we've made it a first-time offense for engaging in prostitution, even in a place where it's legal, is cause for removal.
Thank you. Let me quickly go to Mr. Brandon and thank him very much for Mr. Peralta, who was very effective at a meeting that we had dealing with gun violence. Thank you again. Let me try to get you to answer what you think is the reason for the proliferation of illegal guns. Let me also take note of the fact that over a period of time in the Obama administration, when people ask what the ATF does effectively, 65.4 million gun purchases since Obama took office, 91% more. That means that you were doing 65,376,373 background checks. It looks just to me. What can you say about the proliferation of illegal guns? And which tools does ATF have to combat gun trafficking, and are they helpful? And what is the role that silencers would play in the enhanced gun violence if used inappropriately?
Thank you, ma'am, for the questions. First, on the proliferation of gun violence, I've been an agent for the government 29.5 years. If bad people want to get a hold of guns, they're going to get them. We've seen an increase in federal firearms licensee burglaries, and that increased even from last year to this year, or from 15 to 16, a 56% increase on the number of guns. Some of the motive for those burglaries have been gang-related or related to the opioid, trying to feed their drug habits and so forth. The tools that we have, the comprehensive tracing of firearms at the tracing center is a vital technique and a tool. And like I mentioned in my statement, NIBIN, the National Integrated Ballistics Information Network, is something, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, it's an American issue. It's an effective tool of linking up shootings that you would never detect previously. And when you have that with the comprehensive tracing of firearms, the other tool, and along with the exploiting local police department intelligence, you can go after the trigger pullers who are perpetuating the violence.
Silencers?
Silencers, 42 states now have them legal. It's created a demand for us. It's still covered under the National Firearms Act. The industry refers to them as suppressors. It's something that we're dealing with. Right now we have an 8-month backlog. We've applied resources of 30 additional people. We've applied overtime money to try to fulfill our obligation at ATF to do the background and authorize the silencer to be transferred to the individual purchasing it.
My last point, could you benefit from an increase in ATF officers?
No, ma'am.
You could not benefit from
I couldn't. Yeah, no, I would welcome it. And the pun's intended here. You got a lot of bang for your buck when you put an ATF agent on the street working with the locals.
Thank you. I yield back. Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair will now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Judge Poe.
Thank the chairman. Thank you both for being here. I want to pat my foot and say amen to what the chairman said regarding the work you do in law enforcement. Yesterday morning, we had a peace officer, Clint Greenwood, a friend of mine, was ambushed and murdered. He had an interesting background. He was not just a police officer. He was a prosecutor in the district attorney's office, and a private attorney, worked for the sheriff's department, constable's office for over 30 years. And what you do is dangerous, but it's appreciated. As the chairman mentioned, I was a former judge and a former prosecutor. And I've talked to a lot of former prosecutors over the years, and they've all gone on to do other things. But I think most of them, if not all, always go back to when they were a prosecutor, and those were the best years of their careers. So I want to thank you both for that. I want to deal specifically, Mr. Rosenberg, with the border with Mexico. I have a map here that I got from the DEA, so you're familiar with it. And Mr. Chairman, I'd like unanimous consent to introduce this into the record.
Without objection.
And it shows most of Mexico, except for a few places that are controlled by the drug cartels. The Texas border has on it the Gulf cartels, the Zetas, and the Juarez drug cartels moving drugs into the United States on the Texas-Mexico border. You mentioned in your testimony that the drug cartels work with criminal gangs in the United States. Would a fair statement be primarily one of them is the MS-13 gang?
Certainly, it's one of them.
All right. Do the drug cartels not only bring drugs illegally in the United States, they bring anything else for money, including people, human trafficking, and bring all of that into the U.S. and some cases turn that over to the criminal gangs to disperse it into the United States. Is that a fair statement or not?
I'd say it a little bit differently, sir. These cartels are polycrime and polydrug organizations. They're out to make money. Generally, they stay out of the human smuggling business, except that they often do two things. They tax the human smugglers for the use of their corridors or plazas, and sometimes they'll force people who are coming across the border to carry their stuff. But by and large, they stay out of the human smuggling business to the best of our intelligence.
They subcontract that out to people coming across the border, and that would include human trafficking, would it not?
It includes all sorts of crimes, sir.
Smuggling and trafficking are two different things.
Yes, sir.
Definitions. Would you recommend or not that the Congress consider these drug cartels that have been in operation for years in Mexico, making them foreign terrorist organizations?
I'm sorry, making
them foreign terrorist organizations, labeling them as a foreign terrorist organization?
I don't know the ramifications of that. I haven't been asked that question before. Can I at least think about it a bit and give you an answer?
Just give me your opinion in writing, if you would.
I will.
Recently, on the Texas-Mexico border, primarily in the McAllen sector down by not only the border with Mexico, but the Gulf of Mexico, Texas law enforcement has been working there in connection with border security, putting a lot of boots on the ground, even the National Guard in some places. They got these fast boats that I got to be on. They're quite amazing. They can go 70 miles an hour in 17 inches of water, armed. Is it your opinion, like many others, that that presence on the border for that 100 and 150 miles, the drug cartels quit crossing primarily and just moved upriver more?
It's a bit of whack-a-mole. When we clamp down on one part, they'll find another part because the trade is so lucrative, which is why, in part, we need to change the culture and knock down the demand. But it is a bit of whack-a-mole, sir.
I agree with you. The demand is stop the demand in the United States is the long-term answer. But
yes, sir.
The crossings into the United States by the drug cartels, they are done primarily on the border with Mexico. And if we want to decrease those crossings, we need to have a good presence all the way on the border, not just in portions of the border, to prevent whack-a-mole.
We need good intel, we need good agents, and we need a good presence. Yes, sir.
A couple more questions. What assets do you need on the Texas or the southern border with Mexico? What are the assets you need?
Well, DEA is actually down, believe it or not, about 1,000 employees over the last 5, 6, 7 years, and almost 500 special agents. Now, I don't want anything, sir, at the expense of my brothers and sisters in the Department of Justice, but we are, and this is a cliche, literally doing more with less. We're down quite a bit. And as you look at the demographics of our agent population, we have 30% of our special agents within about 5 years of retirement. So I don't want to call it a crisis, but it is absolutely a challenge. A
crisis. That's what it is. Do you work well with the Mexican government? There's a reputation or a rumor out there that's tense between the United States and the Mexican government. They don't work well. They give you partial information. Sometimes it's wrong. Explain that to me. That's my last question.
We work well. It's not perfect, no relationship is, but we work well. Those are extraordinarily brave men and women in Mexico with whom we partner. We also have a large presence of DEA agents and analysts and professional staff in Mexico. The CMAR, the Mexican Marines, are extraordinary. They go above and beyond the call of duty. And so I would describe the relationship as very good and very healthy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Judge Poe yields back. The chair will now recognize his friend from Florida, Mr. Deutsch.
I thank the chairman, and I thank the ranking member for his kindness in allowing me to jump ahead. Mr. Rosenberg, Mr. Brandon, thank you both for the work that you do for our country, to all of the men and women who work in your important organizations for the service and security that they provide all of us. We appreciate it. Mr. Brandon, Ronald Turk is, as I understand it, year number 2 at ATF. And obviously ATF uses regulations to reduce gun violence and ensure public safety, among other things. And on January 20th, Chief Operating Officer Turk released a white paper entitled Options to Reduce or Modify Firearm Regulations. The white paper begins by recognizing that ATF's enforcement and regulatory efforts are focused on reducing violence and increasing public safety. We couldn't agree more, and we're grateful for that. And yet, it supports and indeed advocates for reducing a number of gun regulations that I think most people would wonder how reducing these regulations would make anyone any safer. The recommendations consider the removal of silencers from the protection of the National Firearms Act, silencers that make it much more difficult for law enforcement and bystanders to hear gunshots and react quickly. The white paper also suggests having further discussions on changing the anti-trafficking program that requires dealers in southwestern states to notify ATF about multiple sales of high-powered rifles. And the white paper calls for examining permitting gun dealers to avoid reporting requirements that assist law enforcement investigating trafficking, even after the dealer has sold many guns that were later used in crimes. There are lots of other proposals to eliminate gun regulations described in this white paper. The proposals in this white paper coming from ATF are greatly concerning to a lot of us. They'd weaken the authority of ATF, they'd undermine the agency's authority to protect public safety. I just would like to know from you, first of all, why was this drafted? What was the purpose of this white paper?
Congressman, thank you for the question. These were the personal views of Associate Deputy Director Ron Turk, my number 2. They're not the positions of the agency.
The white paper doesn't represent the official opinion of ATF. Did anyone ask your number 2, the number 2 at ATF, to offer his personal reflections in a white paper in this way?
The Associate Deputy Director Turk notified me on, it was Inauguration Day, as soon as I saw President Trump sworn in. I went on the White House website and I saw that he was going to have the head of every federal agency review its regulations. I sent an email to all my executive team. Ron wrote back to me, hey, I'm working on a white paper. And I said, well, hey, I'll enjoy your weekend. Well, let's talk on Monday. Part of the process of leading a team is to have deliberations and active conversations about things, but it doesn't necessarily reflect the opinion of the agency. And clearly, that paper is not a position of ATF.
Are any of the concerns raised in the paper shared by ATF? And more specifically, is ATF considering adopting any of the proposals contained in the white paper?
You know, these positions go through the administration. The administration's new, and when, to be candid, when the Deputy Attorney General is confirmed, there'll be various conversations like we have had, previously, and get guidance from the department.
I don't understand what that means. Does that mean they're being considered? Simple.
Yeah, no, I'm trying to be truthful.
Yeah.
Like, we would talk, for instance, silencers.
Yep.
The demand that, 42 states created and the backlog, we were always getting congressional inquiries about what are you doing about the backlog, my constituents waiting. And so we were applying resources, and that's how this conversation came up of, hey, if silencers went under the Gun Control Act and still went through a NICS check, is it still public safety being met, and is it seeing how there's been a change within the country, candidly, at the state level?
So, again, I just want to make sure I understand. So the president was inaugurated, and this review was to commence, and it sounds like he had already started the process. Did someone ask him to do it beforehand?
No, I didn't ask him to do it, and being honest here, which I wouldn't be anything but, he obviously had to be working on it before Inauguration Day.
I think we'd like to find out how that started, but just in my last few seconds, in an exchange you had with the chairman earlier, the chairman referred to the narrow exception about the narrow background check exception, and if I understand you correctly, you said that ATF conducts the background checks at gun shows for those who are in the repetitive, who are in the business of repetitively buying and selling, because they're required to have a license. Is that the narrow exception for those not in the business? How is that defined? What's the definition? How do we know whether someone fits under that narrow exception, as the chairman referred to it?
Well, we produced guidance, sir, on if what is legally required, for your activity. So it's the repetitive sale of firearms for profit and livelihood that said you would fall in and need to be licensed. I just want to be clear, ATF doesn't do these NICS checks. They're done by the FBI, and the federal firearms licensees are required to conduct them before they transfer a firearm to a non-licensee.
So I would just, last question, Mr. Brandon, do you think that the background checks that are done on people who are in the business, acknowledging that it's unclear how we define that, which is something a lot of us think should be done, and that the exception is not narrow at all, but do you think that there would be benefit if we're conducting those background checks for people who buy a gun at a gun store, to have everyone who buys a gun at a gun show or online to be subjected to the same background checks?
So that would be a legislative change that, I shouldn't be commenting on as the head of an agency, but if Congress passed a law, we'd enforce it.
Well, I look forward to that day. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman from Florida yields back. The chair will now recognize the gentleman from Texas, former U.S. Attorney, Mr. Ratcliffe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Brandon, I got the chance to welcome my friend Chuck Rosenberg, and I wanted to be sure that I had a chance to welcome you. We had a chance to visit for the first time yesterday, but before that meeting, I had a conversation with former acting ATF Director Mike Sullivan, who's a close friend and actually former colleague of Mr. Rosenberg as well, and someone whose opinion I value greatly. He described you to me as, quote, conscientious, hardworking, disciplined, open-minded, just a terrific guy and phenomenal human being, end quote. Pretty high praise, and from what I've heard, well-deserved. Having gotten those niceties out of the way, I have what may be a difficult question for you to answer, but one that I think is important. Because I'm from Texas, you wouldn't be surprised to hear that there are quite a few hunters and law-abiding gun owners in my district. And hunters, not just in my state, but certainly across the country, are being forced to use alternative non-lead ammunition. And the problem, as you know, is that manufacturers can't make brass or steel core ammunition for a 30-06 or a 270 deer hunting rifle unless they get a waiver from the Attorney General saying that it's primarily intended for sporting purposes. Now, in a prior hearing when I had the prior Attorney General, Loretta Lynch, in here, I asked about a number of petitions that were pending for those waivers. And at that time, unfortunately, none of those had been granted, but I think even more importantly, none of those had even received a response. So the prior administration, for whatever reason, didn't feel that manufacturers were deserving of a response. Is there any reason for hope or optimism that this administration might respond to this issue?
Sir, thank you for the question, and also please thank Mr. Sullivan. I thank the world of him. He was very good for ATF. Regarding armor-piercing ammunition and the exemption request that we would have from manufacturers, that is true. We haven't been able to act on them. I believe that when the Deputy Attorney General is confirmed, that we will be able to bring our issues to him, and that we will be able to answer the mail to the manufacturers. It's our obligation to do so.
Well, great. I'm very glad to hear that and eager for that to occur. Administrator Rosenberg, I know you'll get a bunch of questions today about marijuana and derivatives, its derivatives as a Schedule I drug. As former prosecutors, we often refer to marijuana as a gateway drug. The more recent statistics seem to lend themselves to the argument that prescription pills have become a gateway drug to heroin. You talked about 4 out of 5 heroin users starting on prescription pills. Is that accurate if I were to refer to it as a gateway drug?
4 out of 5 heroin users begin on prescription pills. That's our best information, sir. Yes.
So in the focus on the opiates and the opioid epidemic in this country, there's been a lot of finger pointing. I know at least one senator that has pointed the finger of blame at DEA, which of course has the power to set the limit for how many opioids can be manufactured in the United States. So do you think that's fair or legitimate criticism? I want to give you a chance to address that publicly.
And I've spoken with that particular senator. I don't think, I understand the impulse, but I don't think the criticism is entirely accurate. Here's why. We do set the aggregate production quota, but we are guided by statute in how we set that aggregate production quota. So it is the ceiling. Manufacturers typically don't manufacture to that ceiling. They manufacture below it. In partial response to that, Mr. Ratcliffe, we have cut the aggregate production quota by 25%. We're trying to be responsive and thoughtful, but as I've tried to explain, and maybe I didn't do a very good job of it, that aggregate production quota is largely driven by statute. We're required to look at last year's manufacturing, last year's production, put aside some reserve, put aside some inventory. So it would require DEA to work with this Congress to reset how that aggregate production quota is determined.
Thank you. As my time's expiring, and I know the chairman's a stickler for time, so I want to get my last question in. You've talked a little bit about the DEA's role. We all know that DEA is really good at reducing supply. That's what law enforcement does. Goes after cartels and the street gangs that source the supply. And the problem, you referred to this earlier, is that we can never enforce or prosecute our way out of the problem. So the other half of the equation is reducing demand. And so you talked a little bit about some of the things that you've been trying to do. You know, obviously public education is part of the answer. You talked about STEM and the Chasing the Dragon video and the National Prescription Drug Take Back program. Has that been effective? What else are you doing, and what, if anything else, can we be doing? What can Congress do to support those efforts on that side?
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, if I may respond in full to that, I'll take a couple of minutes. Mr. Ratcliffe, you are a very good and very highly respected federal prosecutor. And so I think you know as well as anyone that we're not going to prosecute our way out of this mess. That said, I think some of our programs make a lot of sense. Our National Take Back program, for instance, sir, last year on 2 separate days, we took in, and this is a stunning number, 1.6 million pounds of stuff that people dropped off at 5,000 sites around the country. Our next National Take Back Day is April 29th. Now, I want to tell you that we think that about 10% of the stuff that's dropped off are opioids. But even if it's only, because you can drop off anything. You can drop off Bengay, you can drop off an old tennis racket. I mean, we'll take it. But if it's quote unquote only 10%, that's 160,000 pounds of opioids that were returned to the DEA and incinerated in a safe and effective way. So we're going to continue to do that. You mentioned the Operation Prevention Program, sir. With Discovery Education, we have created a STEM-based curricula free of charge to any middle or high school in the nation. I believe the last number I had is that more than 200,000 students have viewed that. So we have to change the culture. It's a hard thing to do. I have a this may seem like a silly example, but I don't think it is. We've changed the culture in the United States with respect to using seatbelts. It took a long time, and it took a lot of determination, but I believe that has saved lives. We can do it here as well.
Thank you, and I just want to close by joining the chairman and asking that you relay to all of the women and men in your agencies, the agents and the team that support those agents, our gratitude as we do approach Police Week coming up. You know, law enforcement officers, much like our armed forces, they courageously face the dangers that others have the luxury of running away from. So please thank your team for the sacrifices they make. I know they miss out on a lot. Crime doesn't sleep, doesn't take a day off, and your team rarely gets a day off as well. So please extend our thanks and gratitude.
We will. Thank you for that, sir.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and he's grateful there's not mandatory minimums for exceeding the time limit. With that, would recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Conyers.
Thank you, Chairman Gowdy. And thank you for your testimony, men. I wanted to direct this to Mr. Rosenberg, Administrator Rosenberg. A small percentage of individuals convicted of violating federal laws are high-level suppliers or major traffickers. But isn't it more constructive to go after the sources of illicit drugs to end or slow the flow of drugs into this country? If it is more constructive to go after the suppliers, how do you explain why the majority of people convicted of violating federal drug laws are in fact low-level sellers instead of suppliers or major traffickers?
Mr. Conyers, if we're doing our jobs right, and we're not perfect, so We don't always get it right. We are aiming at that unholy alliance between the cartels and the violent street gangs. My goal is to hit that spot and work up. It's a very difficult thing to do, as I'm sure you understand. We shouldn't be prosecuting folks for simple possession or simple users or addicts. That would be, I think, a mismanagement.
But you are.
Well, I think in the main we're not, sir. My understanding, at least from the statistics I've seen, is that we are not prosecuting low-level users. We're trying to work our way up the chain, again, not always perfectly. But if I have that wrong, and I'm happy to look at the statistics again, I will come back and tell you that I have it wrong.
Well, I'll look at mine again, too, and let you know, because I think that's key to this whole discussion today. Are we able to go after the major traffickers or not? And if not, then we have to alter our strategy.
As far as strategy goes, sir, my direction to our special agents in charge is very simple. Identify the biggest, most difficult, and most dangerous threats in your jurisdictions and mitigate that. Now, again, hard to do, and we don't always get it right, but that's my direction to them. I don't want us to be spending our limited resources on simple possessors or low-level users, sir.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. This, I think, is one of the biggest issues that we're confronted with. And I wanted to turn to Director Brandon. The Police Foundation and the major City Chiefs Association recently published a report making 25 recommendations detailing how federal government could best assist state and local law enforcement positively impact violent crime. Now, the report spoke of the critical need for a federal firearms trafficking law. How, in your view, would legislation make firearms trafficking a federal crime help ATF and the U.S. attorneys to prevent firearms from getting into the hands of criminals?
Congressman, thank you for the question. And the predecessors to me, distinguished Acting Director Sullivan, that was the U.S. Attorney in Boston, and former Director Jones, both weighed in on this, and I see it the way they do, that a firearms trafficking statute would be effective on going after having more substantial penalties for those that are trafficking in firearms. And the information I learned on it also is that it has like a kingpin, and where instead of getting the paper violations for lying and buying, and we would be able to work our way up and target ultimately the person that's pulling the strings with all these straw purchases, and the statute would help that, along with allowing us as a Title III, could be an investigative technique. It would be a predicate to the RICO statute. So there's a number of things. I'm not an attorney, but I agree with my former bosses that it would be an effective tool in addressing violent gun crime across the country.
It's a big challenge, and if I could get, well, my time's expired. I'll be in touch with you for some more discussion, which if we get it in time, we'll include it in the record. If not, I'll have it for my personal edification, but I have valued you both coming before the committee today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman from Michigan. The chair will now recognize the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to echo the gratitude of all my colleagues, to you good men, and to your colleagues for all of your important work. We're grateful you're at the helm. A couple of quick questions, Mr. Rosenberg, about the National Guard counter-drug program. I'm from Louisiana, and the Louisiana National Guard participates, and from our perspective, the program is shown to be a great resource for state and local agencies to fight against drug abuse and all these problems. I assume you agree it's a valuable program?
Completely agree.
The problem is that despite the clear benefits that are obvious to us of the National Guard program, over the past several years, going back to about 2012, the National Guard's has seen repeated reductions in their funding, and that's affected resources and of course impacted their ability to adequately meet the counter-drug objectives, and it includes limiting the operational capacity to support DEA. We talk a lot about budget cuts, but do you think the level of success in drug and criminal interdiction is where it needs to be? And more specifically, do you think there's added value to the DEA's efforts when the National Guard's able to assist in that way?
I'll take the second question first, sir. Absolutely. As I travel around the country, and I've paid 98 office visits so far to the men and women of DEA in a little under 2 years. I meet men and women of the National Guard everywhere I go. They are an extraordinarily important part of who and what we are. So the second part's easy. With respect to the first part, as I mentioned, we're down more than 1,000 people over the last 5, 6, 7 years, more than 500 special agents, but we're also down intel analysts, professional support, diversion investigators, and so it just makes our job that much more difficult. That's why I love having the National Guard sit with us, high-quality men and women, and they do high-quality work. If you have more, I'll take them.
We'd like to give you more. Over the course of the last 17 years, the El Paso Intelligence Center, EPIC, has grown from an entity consisting of 3 law enforcement agencies to a center comprised now of over 20 agencies, and of course they share a common mission to identify threats to the nation with an emphasis on the southwest border. Just from an outsider's perspective looking in, can you describe for us what the value is in having 20 agencies now involved who have the same mission?
Having a bunch of folks sitting together and exchanging information quickly and I hope seamlessly is enormously valuable. Plus, all these men and women reach back out to their own home agencies and that the resources that they bring to bear. So when you have a lot of really smart and dedicated people sitting in the same room, focused on the same problem set, same mission set, that's a good thing for your government.
I was in a conference room a few moments ago back here. The Louisiana Sheriff's Association is in town, and we were talking about similar issues with coordination among agencies, and we understand how that can work. But when you're doing that, you're maximizing efficiency and communication. Do you experience any collaboration issues with so many federal agencies passing down information and intelligence to the local law enforcement?
Oh, sure, there are bumps, and I'm sure Tom Brandon would tell you the exact same thing. There are bumps. But we're better when we're together, and I know that sounds cliched, but we have fusion centers around the country. We have OCDEF task forces around the country. We sit with our brothers and sisters at ATF and FBI and the Marshal Service around the country. Perfect? No. But to borrow Tom's phrase, you get more bang for your buck that way. It's a good thing.
Appreciate it. That's all I have. I yield back.
Gentleman from Louisiana yields back. The chair will now recognize the other gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here. Let me start with something that's come up before. I would assume both of your agencies use confidential informants?
Yes.
I would assume both of your agencies use confidential informants.
Yes, sir.
Do you track your confidential informants and any crimes that may have been committed by them? Because we learned last year that the FBI does not.
Congressman, thank you for the question. Yes, we do. And as far as when an informant is registered, criminal history is done, and when the semi-annual review, they have to run checks to see if they've been involved in any criminal activity.
And I would assume that means they don't get passes for petty crimes for the work they do?
Any time that the control agent is aware of that activity and it's brought to the supervisor, and depending, like say if they get a parking ticket or if something like that, or drunk in public, they should let the assistant U.S. attorney know that if that person is involved in a case of any unlawful activity, and the judgment call is made whether to continue the informant on the rolls.
Mr. Roseberg.
Yeah, we're also trying to tighten up a bit here, sir. We're not perfect, but we're doing 90-day reviews now. We're bringing it to higher level supervisors. something we didn't do in the past. For instance, if a CS, a confidential source, has been inactive for 6 months or more, we're going to look to shut that down unless a higher level supervisor finds a reason to keep it open. So we have a little tightening up we need to do. I've created a small section within headquarters to essentially audit and inspect how well we're doing this in the field.
Oh, good. Second, and it's more for you, Mr. Rosenberg. Do you agree with this new treatment type approach, addiction, mental health, and real health response to the opioid crisis that we're facing?
Absolutely.
Do you think it would have been more appropriate for the response to the crack epidemic in the early 80s, or do you think that the crack response was adequate? Or knowing what we know now, it should look more like this?
We're better now than we were then. Treatment has to be a part of the solution. Addiction is a disease. I don't want to lose sight on the supply side enforcement role because I think that's very, very important. I think we're better now than we were, 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago. Hopefully in 10 years from now we'll be better still, sir.
Congressman,
go ahead.
May I go back on the informant issue with
Yes.
ATF, because it's an important thing that I forgot to mention. We have a 24/7 monitoring of our informants, so if they get arrested, we'll get notified through NCIC. And also that when we fingerprint them, we run it through AFIS, an automated fingerprint and identification system, to make sure that they're not their true identity. And in case they have fraudulent identification, if they've been arrested previously, we would know if they're lying to us. So I just wanted to supplement with that, and thank you, sir.
Let me, and Mr. Brandon, this is, using it as an example, I don't need you to respond, but this committee held many hearings and was furious about the Fast and Furious program. At least from my knowledge of DEA and other drug agencies, oftentimes part of a bigger sting is letting transactions and other things go through. Now, it's a very specific question. In DEA's past, present, future, any times do you let drugs hit communities in order to get the bigger fish?
We're not supposed to, no, sir.
Okay. Are you aware of any instances where it may happen?
I'll have to check and get back to you on that.
Okay. Last question is, what's the status of the investigation of the DEA agents in New Orleans that are under investigation? And two, do you have a process where you go back and review all of the cases that they've made to make sure that they were legitimate cases?
Second question first, if I may, sir. We are doing that with our federal and state and local prosecutor partners. So absolutely. I'm more limited in what I can say with respect to your first question because it's an ongoing investigation. I made management changes in that division. I added a second SES supervisor to the New Orleans division because we have to get things right there. And we are working closely with both the Inspector General at the Department of Justice and with the FBI on a criminal investigation. But again, I'm somewhat limited in what I can say about that because it's pending.
Let me just close with this. I think transparency and trust and community participation is vital for law enforcement. And I think that it helps our agents. It ensures that they know everything that's going on, and it makes their job safer. But to have that trust and that where people in certain communities will risk their lives to help officers, I think it has to go both ways. And here's just, and you don't have to respond, here's my concern from growing up during the crack cocaine era, which it was a lot heavier of a hand than the opioid response. And the question becomes, is it because of the neighborhood or the victims, or the sellers. Question. Second part, where the Fast and the Furious, the victims were police officers, and that is very, very tragic. The question becomes, do we get drugs back in our neighborhoods, which creates more addicts, more crack babies, and more other things? Is it because of who the victims are? Now, assuming in the best light that I am reaching on both of those, it does affect your ability to get cooperation from certain communities. And we just have to think about how we address it, and whatever's happened in the past as it happened, but we have to address it because there is that festering feeling, and I think that it doesn't serve law enforcement well because you don't get the assistance that you need, and it doesn't serve those communities either. So with that, I look forward to working with both of you all to make sure we can close some of those gaps.
Gentleman from Louisiana yields back. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Rosenberg, Mr. Brandon, thank you for your service. Thanks for being here today. You know, for 8 years, the Obama administration was continually pushing the supposition that far too many low-level, nonviolent drug offenders were being investigated and prosecuted and imprisoned federally. President Obama issued 1,715 commutations. That represents an awful lot of federal man hours, women hours, hours where people had their lives on the line to make those arrests and see them through to prosecution. He also had a flat 212 outright pardons of drug offenders that he claimed were serving lengthy prison terms. At one time, I'd looked, and the figures Jeff Sessions had gotten was that seemed like nearly 3/4 of those who were in federal prison for simple possession actually were not in the United States. They weren't U.S. citizens. They weren't here legally. But the number of possessions, there weren't that many in federal prison for possession compared to traffickers. So the public has gotten the idea that people in federal prison are these poor guys that maybe they smoked a joint or something and ended up doing life without parole. But my experience in my time as a state assistant DA and my time as a felony judge, the federal prosecutors normally didn't take small cases. What is your experience, Mr. Rosenberg?
I was a federal prosecutor, sir, for many years, and I just personally did not see cases involving low-level first-time offenders. We didn't have the resource. We had neither the resources nor the inclination to do those types of cases. Now,
the state did, though, right? If there was something to prosecute, they would go ahead. You would say, we're waiving off, you guys take it?
It wouldn't be unusual, sir, for a case to be split, where we take the higher level, more serious offenders
the federal
federally.
Would take the higher,
and others go to state prosecutors or are null prost. That's entirely possible, too. But from a federal perspective, that was not my experience that we would do low-level first-time offenders.
And when we see somebody in federal prison for simple possession, makes me wonder, based on my experience, I want to ask your experience, did you see people offered a plea agreement that they'd only be prosecuted for simple possession if they would turn and help them go after the other guy? It seemed like that was the only time federal officials wanted to go after simple possession.
That's plausible. Ironically enough, given my current job, I was actually not a narcotics prosecutor when I was an assistant U.S. attorney. But there might be reasons why you find folks who fit that description in federal prison, but it has to be the exception and not the rule. It has to be, in my experience, an extenuating circumstance or somebody who may have plea bargained down to something like that. but it would surprise me if there was a very large number of that.
Well, there weren't that many in federal prison, simple possession. Well, we have a president who had promised, you may have heard something about something called a wall, and some think that's being punitive to Mexico, but it seems to me when you look at Mexico, they have some of the hardest working people in the world. The location is absolutely perfect for being maybe the greatest trading partner the world has ever seen, with 2 oceans, 2 continents on either side, and yet there's not, I mean, their economy is in the 60s. It seems like they ought to be in the top 10, but the reason I keep hearing over and over companies are not moving there more quickly than they are is corruption, and corruption's related to the drug cartels related to the tens of billions of dollars in drugs coming across our border. If we secured the border with a wall where it's possible and really got serious about securing the border, yeah, there may be tunnels, but there's new technology that could anticipate and determine when there were being tunnels. If we really got serious about enforcing that border, what would you see based on your experience happening to drug availability in the illegal drug availability in the United States?
Here's what worries me, sir. As long as there remains a significant demand in the United States and a significant profit to be made from meeting that demand, the traffickers are going to find a way to get this poison into our country. As far as a wall goes...
So you don't see, no matter how much we protect ourselves from the free flow of narcotics across our southern border, it won't affect any supplies here in the U.S.?
I'm not a border...
That's an interesting position, by the way.
I'm not, border security is important, and I've worked in national security, so I appreciate its importance. I'm talking about a more, sort of a smaller dynamic, which is with a significant demand and a significant profit margin. I worry that traffickers are going to find a way. Under, around,
I understand your worry. I just wanted to get, you're under oath basically here. It's a crime to not tell the truth to a congressional committee. So I just want to make sure the record's clear your position. We secure the border, cut drugs to a trickle coming in from Mexico. You don't see it having much effect.
No, I didn't say that, sir.
You said they'll find a way to be here.
I believe they'll find a way to be here.
So that won't affect, so it won't affect the drug availability.
We could well see price fluctuations. Look, it's a good thing to secure our border, no question. It'll make a difference in the work we do. I just find it difficult to imagine, given the profit that's to be made, that we could turn it down to zero.
My time's expired.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from great state of New York, my friend Mr. Jeffries is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, my question though was not would it get it to zero, would it materially affect, and I didn't get an answer to that.
The record will reflect the gentleman's question. Now the gentleman from New York, Mr. Jeffries.
I thank the distinguished chairman for yielding, for his leadership, as well as the distinguished witnesses, Mr. Rosenberg and Mr. Brandon, for your presence and for your service to this country and helping to make America as safe as it can possibly be. I just wanted to turn to Mr. Rosenberg for a few questions with respect to the trajectory of the war on drugs that has been underway here in America for the last few decades. Would it be accurate to say that the war on drugs has been underway now for more than 45 years?
Yeah, I don't use that terminology, but it's been around for a long time.
I guess the demarcation point in terms of the beginning of the so-called war on drugs was when Richard Nixon declared drug abuse in America public enemy #1. He did that in 1971, is that correct?
I don't know when he declared it. I know he created the DEA in 1973.
Now, at the time that the DEA was created in 1973, there were approximately 350,000 or so people incarcerated in America. Is that right?
I don't know.
today there are more than 2.1 million people incarcerated in America. Is that correct?
I don't know. Is that state and federal, sir?
That's state and federal.
Yeah, I'll accept your number. I don't know the number.
Okay. So, I mean, is that a relevant bit of information in terms of the person in charge of such an important and prominent organization, the DEA? How many Americans are incarcerated in this country?
For any crime or?
Any crime.
Yeah, it's a relevant bit of information.
Okay, and a significant number of those individuals, that 2.1 million, are incarcerated as a result of drug crimes. Is that correct?
Probably a significant portion, yes, sir.
I think numbers that I've seen, maybe approximately 50% of those individuals incarcerated overall nonviolent drug crimes in some way, shape, or form. Now, the DEA, I think, initially had approximately 1,500 special agents when the agency was created in '73. Is that right?
I'd have to check the number, but it's less than we have now.
And currently the number is a little over 4,000. Is that right?
About 4,500, 4,600.
And the DEA's initial budget in 1973 was about 75 million. Is that correct?
Don't know.
But the budget today is a little over 2 billion.
Correct.
Per year. Now, so I think, is it fair to say that during the 45-year plus history of the so-called war on drugs, I know it's not a phrase, and I understand why, that you would embrace.
I don't think it's very descriptive, which is why I don't use it.
During that 45-plus year period, it's fair to say that there's been a significant increase in the number of people incarcerated, significant increase in the number of the agents that the agency has at its disposal, although I understand that there's a shortfall in your view, and I think all of us are concerned about that possibility, but a significant increase compared to when the agency was initially enacted, and a very significant increase in the amount of yearly resources allocated, 75 million at one point in '73, over $2 billion. But during that same period of time, am I correct that though the nature of the drugs that Americans have used and or been subject to a variety of different crises, heroin, methamphetamines, crack cocaine, now back to heroin, fentanyl, opioid, that has changed, but the crisis has remained the same. Is that correct?
By crisis, you mean the amount of violence that attends it, the number of people dying?
All of the above.
Yeah, those are big numbers, and it worries me.
In fact, you can make the argument based on what you said earlier in terms of the overdoses that took place in 2015, the most recent year for which we have figures, that in some ways the drug crisis in America has not gotten better, it's gotten worse, correct?
Which is why, as I've mentioned, we have to also attack the demand side, and we have to educate, and we have to treat.
So we've done some things right, we've done some things wrong. I think that's fair to say.
I agree with that. Yeah.
Based on where we were, where we are today. But what exactly, in your view, as succinctly as possible, my time is running out, do you think we can do differently based on the fact that we've expended a significant amount of resources devoted to this problem? The nature of the crisis has changed. The intensity of it has either remained the same or gotten worse. And we've exploded our incarcerated population to a point where we now incarcerate more people than any other country in the world. And thankfully, there's a bipartisan effort in which the chairman and others are involved in to try to deal with this mass incarceration phenomenon. But from your perspective, as a top law enforcement professional, what can we do differently?
That's a very good question. I'm not sure how succinct I can be in answering it because I think it's multi-layered. I will say this. I think the mix of stuff that we're trying to do, demand reduction, supply reduction, and regulation is the right mix. And we could always debate, how much should be in each bucket. But I've actually seen, while I see some bad trajectories and some bad news, sir, I've also seen some good news. I've seen communities where I think we've made a difference. I've talked to families and who have helped us get the message to kids about the dangers of opioids and heroin. I think our national take-back program works. I think we should continue down those paths. I think we're thinking about treatment and rehabilitation in much more sophisticated and helpful ways than we have in the past. I'm already probably violating your request that I be succinct, but I'd be happy to come talk to you about it some more if you'd have me.
Well, I only made that request to indulge the chairman in his desire to move this hearing along. But I appreciate your willingness, and I appreciate the chairman giving you the opportunity to respond.
I appreciate the gentleman from New York being concerned about the time limit. I wish other members had your same sense of fairness. With that, the gentleman from Utah is recognized for his 5 minutes.
I assure the chairman I will be punctual. Thank the chairman. To both the ATF and DEA, I can't thank the men and women enough who are on the front lines doing the hard, difficult work through their lives in jeopardy on a regular basis. And I hope you both carry that back, and they know how much people root for them, care for them, and are concerned about them. We also in Congress have to be concerned about the expenditures and making sure that we're giving proper oversight. Mr. Rosenberg, I want to talk about the confidential informant policy. It's been a source of a scathing review by the Inspector General's office, how that's being executed. There was a supplement to that as well. You have a confidential informant policy in place, correct?
Which now meets the Attorney General's guidelines, yes, sir.
And we have been trying in the Oversight and Government Reform Committee, as well as Senator Grassley in the Senate Judiciary Committee, to get a copy of this, this policy. Why won't you give it to us?
Well, 2 things, sir. One is I believe we've made it available to you and to Senator Grassley's staff for in-camera review, if I'm not mistaken. In terms of just providing it, that goes back to Department of Justice policy, by which I am constrained.
You testified on June 22nd of 2016. You said to Senator Grassley in a Senate hearing regarding this policy, quote, "It has been finalized. It's been approved by the department. I'm more than happy to provide a copy to this committee and to your staff, sir," end quote. Yet you didn't do that. Who is prohibiting you from giving that copy to Congress? Well, I see a huge difference between an in-camera review and actually providing it to the Congress.
And I respectfully don't see a huge difference. I understand your point. We've made it available for in-camera review.
And that's true, by the way. That's my understanding of it as well. But I just don't understand what you believe Congress has the right to have and not have the right to have. You freely give it to the Inspector General, but you won't give it to the United States Congress.
Well, and while I don't see a big difference, I understand your point. Nevertheless, I am constrained by the Department of Justice.
Who at the Department of Justice is telling you this?
The name of the person? I don't know, sir.
You give me that name?
I'll ask the Department of Justice if I can give you that name. I will give you...
No. Come on. That's silly season here.
No, I don't think it's...
I want to know specifically because there's hundreds of thousands of people involved here. I need a name. Can you give that to me by the end of the week?
I will ask.
No.
I can provide
I'm asking you to give me the name of the person who is denying access to this. Here's what I'm forced to do. We have a hearing next door in the Oversight Committee as well with your deputy, both of your deputies.
Yes.
We are issuing a subpoena.
Okay.
And so I see no choice. We've been trying to do this. Senator Grassley's been trying to do this. I've been trying to do this. Department of Justice doesn't get to hide things from the United States Congress. And there is a huge difference between an in-camera review, no notes, people looking over your shoulder. You can't, members of Congress have a very difficult time accessing that information. And if we're going to provide proper access, it seems like we should be able to review this, especially in light of hundreds of millions of dollars over the course of a year going out the door. The Inspector General giving you all a quote-unquote gentleman's C, as he called it, to grade how this is done. We've had massive problems with people misusing money and assets
And so I'm left with no choice. I've issued you a subpoena.
Okay.
We expect you to comply with that subpoena. I wish I didn't have to do that.
No, I understand.
But I want to have a further discussion, and I need names as to who's holding us back at the Department of Justice.
I can promise you two things. I will look at the subpoena carefully, and I will have a further discussion with you.
Fair enough. Mr. Chairman, I have plenty of time on the clock, but I'm happy to yield back.
Gentleman shockingly yields back with 33 seconds left. I will now recognize myself to go last. Gentlemen, 5 minutes is not much time to resolve issues. It's barely enough time to raise them. So I don't know that I'll have that many questions for you other than raise points that I would like you to reflect upon. And then over the course of your tenure, and as long as I'm in Congress, would like to work with your respective agencies to see if we can make some progress. I know both of you have been in the justice system before, so you've seen the majesty of a system that exceeds people's expectations. There's a reason we have a phrase, "May justice be done though the heavens fall." And it is beautiful and majestic to watch a justice system that inspires people. On the other side, if you've ever had witnesses that had knowledge refuse to cooperate, you've had victims that had no expectation whatsoever that the system would work for them. Perception is reality, and when you have communities among our American family that don't have confidence in the justice system, it's all of our problems. And we can debate the legitimacy of those perceptions, but the perceptions remain. So my focus on whatever amount of time I have left in this job is to try to find that justice system that is not just respected, but worthy of respect, aspirationally worthy of respect. So I'm going to raise some issues that may be unusual for Republicans to raise. And I will start with the ratio between cocaine base and cocaine powder. I understand it's a rational basis test. I understand we just have to have a reason for it, or at least they did when the law was initially passed. But at some point, Mr. Rosenberg, I'd love to sit down with whoever the pharmacological experts are at at the DEA and understand what it is about the pharmacology of baking soda that makes the ratio 18 to 1. And if there is a basis for it, then help me understand it. I get, going back to con law, there's a rational basis test, but confidence in the justice system is the most compelling national interest we could possibly have. So I'd love to work with the DEA and understand why a 1-to-1 ratio isn't better. Mandatory minimums. Some think they work great in violent crime cases. I would be in that camp. Less so for perhaps economic or nonviolent crime cases. Also, as a former prosecutor, no, mandatory minimums are an effective way to get folks to cooperate. But whether or not the drug amount levels need to be raised, whether there can be some proportionality as we, treat methamphetamine and heroin and cocaine powder and cocaine base. Marijuana, it takes tractor trailers full to reach a mandatory minimum, but not so with other drugs. To my friends at ATF, 924E, I haven't seen the statistics, but when you have someone who has more than one felony conviction, and they are in possession of a firearm or ammunition, that has a lot more jury appeal. Trust me, I get the lack of jury appeal for 922G cases. I lived it. It is hard to get a jury interested in lying and buying or simply being a felon in possession of a gun that you're going to use to go squirrel hunting and you had a conviction 20 years ago. There is not a lot of jury appeal. Murder cases have jury appeal. But our objective is to prevent the murder prosecution, is to save the life. And I've seen it done in South Carolina. Bill Nettles was the United States Attorney in South Carolina. He was appointed by President Obama, so politically we're on opposite ends of the spectrum. But he did great work at part of 922G that deals with domestic violence. South Carolina ranks #1 in the nation in men killing women. So he used the 922G, that subsection that relates to orders of protection and domestic violence convictions, that's a misdemeanor. It's not a felony in South Carolina. Certain domestic violence cases are. But to Chairman Goodlatt's point, it'd be great to see, it'd be great for me to see your referrals versus the declinations. If you're getting the cases from state and locals and you're writing up a blue book or whatever they call them now, and it's being declined by the Assistant United States Attorney, we need to know it. And if you're presenting 924E cases and they're being declined, we need to know it. And I'm not beating up on prosecutors, I actually like them, but I need to know where if there's been a decrease in firearms prosecutions, it's either the referrals have dried up, or you're not adopting them, or you're adopting them and they're being declined, and we need to figure that out. 922G also includes a subsection for people who have been adjudicated mentally defective. Those are the words of the statute. Those are not my words. So we'll just go with mental illness. Those who have been adjudicated mentally ill. That is already against the law for someone who's been adjudicated that to possess a firearm or ammunition. And when I look at the statistics for the prosecutions, they're anemic. And I don't know if it's because the cases aren't being referred, if they're not being adopted, or if there's been a declination. So within firearms, one other point, I hear some of my friends mention a gun show loophole. There may be a background check loophole, but there's not a selling of a firearm to a prohibited person loophole. You can be prosecuted for giving a firearm to a prohibited person, whether you're an FFL or not. And one way to get the attention of folks who don't think that they have to do background checks is to see an uptick in prosecutions for folks who fail to ask simple questions. Are you a convicted felon? Have you been adjudicated mentally ill? Are you subject to a restraining order in a domestic violence case? The notion that you can sell a firearm to whoever you want to is just not accurate. Maybe from a background check, but not from the actual transfer of the weapon. And last point, Mr. Rosenberg, I know it's hard to prosecute doctors. I grew up with one. He's the most popular person in the community that I grew up in, and I never would have won the district attorney's race had it not been for my father. I get how popular doctors are. Also get that it's impossible to get a prescription without going to a doctor. And there used to be a DEA diversion group that investigated physicians who were writing prescriptions outside the course of a legitimate medical practice. I assume DEA is still doing that. I hear more on the drug companies, the distributors, than I do that middle component. But getting physicians to understand that you cannot write prescriptions for controlled substances on napkins at a bar for someone that you just met, which is the fact pattern of one of the cases I handle. Getting that message out may also be part of us combating the opioid epidemic that we have. So I'm going to recognize the ranking member for her concluding remarks, but I'll just tell you this, raised a lot of issues. I would love, not you're too busy and you're too busy, but just assign someone to come help me either understand what's going on, or maybe we can make improvements on where they ought to be made. I want a justice system that people respect. So with that, you're welcome to respond, and then I'm going to recognize a ranking member from Texas.
Happy to come talk to you myself about those issues. They're also very important to me. I heard someone recently describe the majesty of our justice system in the following way. Actually, I had not heard it before. I thought it was really interesting. We have courts in which the United States government can lose, and we do. To me, I think that is, again, we're all human, therefore we're all flawed. None of us are perfect. But the fact that the United States government can lose in its own courts tells you that we have a justice system that should be admired and, frankly, copied.
Mr. Chairman, can I speak for a minute?
Sure.
I couldn't agree with you more about justice system worthy of trust, and that's one thing that drilled into our new hires, the special agents and everyone, is that everybody is worthy of trust, and that's in the culture of ATF, and we look forward to working with you. And if the committee would ever like a demonstration of the National Integrated Ballistics Information Network, we just had a van built out along with the trailer where you can do test fires so it can respond to scenes. We briefed the Attorney General on it last Monday. But if that's something that you as the chairman would like to see, we'd be happy to bring it up to Capitol Hill.
Thank you. With that, I'll recognize the ranking member for any concluding remarks you may have.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so very much, and thank you particularly for giving me the opportunity to have just a few brief closing remarks. Let me say that I think you are seeing the evidence in this committee, I hope, of our very strong attempt to work in a bipartisan way. So, Mr. Brandon, it will be the chairman and the ranking member that may, if we decide, welcome that vehicle to come. It's also the chairman and the ranking member, as I conclude, that again offers her appreciation to the men and women who work for you, Mr. Rosenberg, the DEA, and then Mr. Brandon for the ATF, and all of the law enforcement officers that work throughout the nation, and particularly those under our jurisdiction, which is a federal jurisdiction. I want to just raise two quick points as it relates to legislation that we've been working on, the Sentencing Reduction Act, where we took special note. We were dealing with drug offenses, nonviolent. We think we were on the right track on reducing sentences. But what came to mind was fentanyl. And I just want a quick answer, Mr. Rosenberg, so that my time will not be yielded away, how dangerous and how prolific that is, and how important it is that we work together on that.
Very succinctly, incredibly dangerous and very important. Fentanyl is up to 50 times more potent than heroin. Carfentanil, which we're beginning to see, is up to 100 times more potent than fentanyl. So extraordinarily dangerous.
So we will work with you on that. I would like to invite you to my office. We have an epidemic of Kush. I don't know if you've heard that word in our area in Houston, Texas, and I'd like to follow up on some questions that I've raised on the question of drugs.
I'd be delighted.
Thank you. Let me, and certainly would welcome the chairman joining on some of the meetings that he's asked and some of the meetings that I've asked. I just want to quickly read into the record one of the responsibilities of the ATF, and that is to deal with gang violence and violent actions as one of your works. Would you please, and I ask unanimous consent to put into the record, let me just read it specifically, I'm sorry, it is to reduce risk to public safety caused by criminal organizations and gangs. I think that is still one of your responsibilities. I want to put into the record, ask unanimous consent, the Gang Resistance Education and Training Program, which I discussed this weekend, Mr. Chairman. Ask unanimous consent. I'd also like to offer my sympathy, but also put into the record the headline, Purview shaken after the deaths of two students over the weekend, ages 21 and 20, not far away from being students in middle school and elementary. Would you just quickly say how important, and can we expand the great program? How important you have seen it, and can we expand it?
Yes, ma'am. I was the special agent in charge in Detroit, and I was an advocate for gang resistance education and training. The program was started in 1991 by the Phoenix PD and ATF, and it trains officers primarily, but also federal agents to go into the middle school classes. They have a curriculum, and it's really to train them on controlling their emotion, impulse control. I was at Detroit Homicide when an 18-year-old kid pulled the trigger over a beef over a female, and he ruined his life. And I was friends with the homicide detective that was a task force officer with us. And it was, for lack of a better word, learn how to hit the pause button so you don't do something that you ruin your life, you ruin another person's life. And I believe there were studies to validate the effectiveness of GREAT. And every year we had the kids that would successfully go through the program would be treated to a Detroit Tiger game, a great game, and they'd have someone of influence to talk to them and give them a congratulatory speech on doing that. So I'm a fan on prevention, and then I'm a fan on going after the trigger pullers. And I think that, like what Chuck Rosenberg said, and as all of you know, you got to address it from both sides, and GREAT does that.
I thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think there are many ways that we can work together on really making the criminal justice system work for everyone, both those who are unfortunately victims on the enforcement side, but certainly on the justice side as well, and the prevention side, which I think is crucial to how should I say, moving America forward. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you so very much.
Yes, ma'am. This concludes today's hearing. I want to thank both of our witnesses again. Without objection, all members have 5 legislative days to submit additional questions for the witnesses or additional materials. For the record, last thing I'll ask you to do is first thing I ask you to do, make sure the women and men that work for your respective agencies, not just the agents, administrative folks, folks that run background checks, all of them know how grateful we are for their service. With that, we're adjourned.
10-4.